Welcome to another episode of the Kernel Network podcast. I'm here with Midori Matthew, who's part of our research team here in the lab. Our lab recently published a couple of papers this year. The first one was in BMC Medical Ethics, and it explores the views of doctors who practice in end-of-life care on the distinction between killing and allowing to die, which is drawn in the philosophical bioethical literature. The second paper was published more recently in Palliative Medicine Reports, and it covers the opinions of palliative care doctors about whether medical assistance in dying should be part of palliative care. Congratulations, Midori, on adding these two papers to your list of accomplishments, and thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. To start us off, Midori, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit from your perspective as lead author on these two papers about what each of the two papers is about.
Of course. So the first paper is about that difference between killing and allowing to die, which is a big object of discussion in bioethical literature when we look specifically at the difference between procedures like withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, which is widely accepted among palliative medicine experts, and medical assistance in dying, or voluntary active euthanasia. So this literature often is devoid of those clinical perspectives. So when bioethicists talk, they speak in very esoteric terms, they speak in terms of formal logic, without engaging with those who are present at the bedside in either or both of these procedures. So this paper aims to get at the crux of this argument empirically. So our goal was to speak with physicians who are involved with either or both practices to determine where they see that difference lying, as in, are one or both procedures more so allowing to die? Is MAiD more so killing than withdrawing life-sustaining treatment? And to figure out how they perceive the usefulness of these bioethical distinctions that are so often used without engagement with them.
Excellent. So the first paper was about that distinction between medical assistance in dying, which includes euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, what's been traditionally called that, and withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. And then the second paper was more about the relationship between medical assistance in dying and palliative care. Is that right? Can you say a little bit more about that one?
Yeah, and that second paper, which was published in Palliative Medicine Reports, is about how and if medical assistance in dying fits within the scope of palliative care. And as I'm sure we are all well aware, this is a hotly contentious topic in both clinical circles and among larger societal discourses. So again, these are discourses that often happen from people's own centered worldviews in their own little bubbles, without engaging, again, with the perspectives of folks who would be providing these procedures or might have patients asking them to be referred to someone who would be comfortable giving them MAiD. So again, big question in this paper, we spoke to palliative care specialists to determine, does MAiD have a place in the palliative care toolbox? And if so, how does it fit? And if not, why not? And how do we, or rather even can we, learn to coexist between those two practices?
Yeah, some kind of heavy topics in a way. I'd like to ask you more detail about like what you found in talking to these doctors. But before asking that, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what was that like for you as a researcher, going in and interviewing these doctors, talking about somewhat sensitive topics that people might have some kind of strong feelings about. What was that experience like?
It was interesting. It was very enlightening. So in terms of, I just first want to talk about the timeline of these two projects. So our first paper that we published this year, we did data collection for that during the COVID era, right? And I was still a master's student at that point. I was very new to the world of qualitative research, and you were gracious enough to let me really take the lead as sort of a co-interviewer with Dr. Bonner.
You did a great job.
I appreciate that, but it was definitely very intimidating as a new graduate student to come in, and there's already a bit of a power imbalance. Typically, we see the power imbalance between researcher and participants, the researcher being here and the participant kind of being here. But it's a bit skewed when you're working with physicians, where there is a sort of natural power imbalance of this like person who does life or death treatments and is very knowledgeable, has so much expertise. And then a graduate student who's totally new to this saying, okay, like, I hope I'm asking you the right things. I hope that I'm touching on things that are worth your time. So the experience for that one was quite intimidating, but very enlightening. And as you said already, they're very contentious topics. These are very emotional topics. I think one thing that's very surprising is that there's tears, surprisingly, when you're having these conversations with physicians who have been at the bedside providing MAiD, or even simply being faced with the request as, say, a palliative care specialist, with a patient saying, I want to end my life, my suffering is too severe. And just the emotion of that, someone saying, I can't go on, I can't do this, it stays with them.
Yeah.
And even that was something that was quite enlightening to me as someone who at that point in time was new to the world of qualitative research, in terms of how do we maintain this division between researcher and participant while also providing a supportive and safe space for them to share those potentially somewhat traumatic experiences, right? As some of them did perceive it as such.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that makes me think about, because coming at this project more from the philosophy side, I'm trained in philosophy, and so I like to go into those abstract debates and kind of figure out the reasoning behind it and the reasoning on either side, and weigh up the value of the arguments and those kind of things. But I found in my own examination of the bioethics literature on these topics that they can be a little bit distanced from that concrete lived situation, and that's what we were kind of trying to get at, right? Was the lived experience. And when you talk about that situation of a clinician who's at the bedside, for them it's not like an academic debate. You're dealing with a real person. There's such real consequences for these actions right in the moment, and bringing that sort of lived experience perspective into the realm of the debate to try to make it a little bit more concrete and real. And that's kind of in a way what we were after.
Of course, and I think we achieved that. I mean, I might be biased in saying that, but of course it's enlightening when you might read CBC or you might read something in the mainstream media and it's like, oh, okay, this sounds good, this sounds bad, I believe in bodily autonomy, doctors believe in paternalism. It's easier to treat it as something black and white, more cut and dry. But in these interviews, it definitely wasn't that way. Even among physicians who, say, were ardently opposed to MAiD, said that they wanted no part in it, said that it was killing. Not allowing to die is something that's more widely accepted, like withdrawing life-sustaining treatment is. There's still all sorts of nuances and moral hurdles that they go through in their own minds that you could sort of see at play when you're communicating with these physicians face to face and even watching them cognate.
And that's what makes these such complicated topics, as we know from just looking at the argumentation and the debates that have taken place in the academic realm, in the public sphere, in government, in law. These are like complex, difficult topics. There's a lot of different ethical principles that are at play, and maybe you can kind of see that playing out in the experience of the doctors who are trying to work through this for themselves, whatever side they might be on. They can kind of feel the push and the pull of the different ethical considerations that are involved. Yeah, well, that kind of maybe gets us naturally to, if we could talk a little bit about the findings of these two papers and their importance. Whether you want to sort of describe a little bit what you found through these interviews in the first paper and the second paper, but also like, why are they important? Why does it matter that what we found out in talking to doctors? And in particular, what I'm always interested in the Kernel Network is how can we make end-of-life care better in Canada? And so if you have any thoughts about that, I know that gets us into a lot of space here, but just pick and choose something from that realm.
No, of course, and that's a great question, and of course that's the goal of research in general. What's the point in doing it if it doesn't have some sort of real-world impact or application to the lives of folks who could benefit from better systems integration, better healthcare systems in general? So the findings of that first paper, which again, killing versus allowing to die as it relates to withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and medical assistance in dying, we found that there, most interestingly, was a strong offense to the use of the word killing. Among MAiD providing physicians, when you're referring to MAiD. So in the actual philosophical literature, the word killing is used quite neutrally and descriptively, as far as I could glean from my own kind of experience.
I think that's
literature.
right, that people use the term that way just to describe the act of doing something that causes somebody else to die, and without necessarily paying attention to the emotional connotations that word can have for people, right? And oftentimes that word killing is associated with like wrongful killing, murder or something like that, right? And when you suggest that a doctor might be doing a procedure that is like that, that obviously is not what they're experiencing it to be like at all. It seems very, very different than that. So yeah, you're pointing to how philosophers use terms in a way that aiming for accuracy, but the emotional and the overtones of those words aren't necessarily taken into consideration when you're just working out the meanings and the logic of things.
Of course, and I feel like that was something that was really reflected from engaging with those clinical perspectives, is the fact that there was this strong distaste towards the word killing. And I recall one participant had even said something along the lines of, "I'm not a soldier in Iraq, I'm not holding a gun to someone's head, I am giving this life-ending treatment to an adult who is consenting to it, who has asked me to do it. I'm not taking their life without that role of consent, without that role of patient autonomy. So how dare you use that word to describe me?" And that came up so many times. And that was really interesting to both Dr. Bonner and I, because again, we're not physicians, right? We're academics, and we hadn't personally considered how serious that would be when these physicians who do provide MAiD, by and large, would say, well, they're both allowing to die because we are allowing someone to die who wants to die, right? Or even the role of both medical assistance in dying and the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, which follows something like putting someone on dialysis, putting someone on a breathing tube, that itself is an artificial medical treatment to extend a life that would otherwise be ended. So that logic was used to say, in this case, both of them are allowing to die, or in this case, both of them are killing, right? Because you've already put someone on a device that, again, they wouldn't be surviving without. So what ultimately is that difference other than having a bit of a queasy feeling in the back of your mind, saying that maybe this isn't ethically sound?
Yeah, I feel like philosophers try to take those actions that have moral implications to them, and they try to analyze these actions, and so those distinctions come up, and they're viewed to be very important because obviously killing is associated with wrongful action, and so allowing to die, if an act can be classed as allowing to die and not killing, then it kind of puts it in a different category and maybe makes it more okay or something like that, right? Philosophers try to analyze those things, but physicians, in the context, I guess in a way, what relevance might this debate that philosophers have about these different actions, why might that be like helpful or important in the context of end-of-life care? I mean, I think it obviously it contributes something to talk to doctors about their experience and their view of this, contributes something back into the philosophical debate, because it gives us that concreteness and that attention to lived clinical experience and what this is really like in practice. But is there some way that the philosophical debate itself might be like helpful for people in clinical practice, or do you think it's sort of totally irrelevant?
So ultimately, and again, I might be biased, I have to believe that it is helpful, right? Because in my opinion, if you're not thinking through these large bioethical questions, you shouldn't really be in healthcare in general, right? I think personally, to me, I would be a bit concerned if my own physician said that they weren't thinking through things ethically, thinking through their actions day to day, even them taking the Hippocratic Oath when they're entering medical school. To me, it's like these questions have to be in the back of your mind, the principles of doing no harm, of beneficence. It's very valuable.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was always the opinion of the clinicians themselves, though, which was another interesting finding that we had in that first paper, is that one of the questions in our interview guide was, so in these discussions and questions about killing and allowing to die, is this helpful? at your own kind of bedside practice, right? And your own clinical experiences. And by and large, so many of them said no. And that was a little bit shocking, because the way that they cognated on that was they were saying no for reasons of, oh, well, these current philosophical debates are divorced from the bedside. Like, I'm not necessarily thinking through this literature when I'm holding someone's hand and they have stage 4 cancer of some sort. So of course, I'm not thinking about this. I'm not really considering this in relation to my practice. And I was kind of thinking, well, you might not consciously be thinking of it, but it certainly is guiding your actions. I mean, even if you chose to become a MAiD provider post 2016, you had to think about that decision in a somewhat ethical way, right?
Yeah,
because
yeah.
if you were just saying non-ethically, oh, I want to take someone's life, well, that's bordering on a bit criminal, isn't it? So you have to be thinking bioethically the differences between these things.
I like how you're putting that. And I mean, the very like professional identity of a doctor is grounded in certain ethical understandings. You mentioned the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, and traditionally killing has been understood to be a significant type of harm. Now, I mean, you were also mentioning earlier how doctors will kind of say, well, this isn't really a typical instance of killing someone, because typically in killing, typically in wrongful killing, the person doesn't want to be killed. In the context that we're talking about, this is where someone has sensitively explored the matter with another person and that they're consenting autonomously. I mean, in the ideal condition, they're consenting to the procedure and they're actually requesting it to be done on their behalf. So there's some differences there. So so far we've been talking a lot about the first paper, and I think that's good. But you did the second paper as well, and in a way it was a bit of a continuation of the issue, but then it became more focused on this question of whether in Canada MAiD should be part of palliative care. And that's maybe a bit of a weird question, like why would anyone care or think about that? Do you want to say anything about like why is that question important, or why might that question matter, and how might it matter for Canadian end-of-life care?
Definitely. So what I find so interesting about even the background of that second paper that we did was, again, the question is, should MAiD be part of palliative care in Canada? If it is part of it, how is it part of it? And if not, why not? How do we keep them separate? How do we let these two very different procedures work together, if that's the case? So some background on that is that a lot of philosophically minded individuals and even health policy minded individuals might look at MAiD and palliative care and say, well, these are fundamentally different. There's already a ton of op-eds out there that say that these two things are very different, that palliative care as a specialty doesn't see itself as one of death, it sees itself as one of comfort, right? And bringing comfort to those who face life-limiting illnesses. They don't really center themselves around death. However, what I find interesting is that public perception and discourse doesn't necessarily echo that same belief. So again, these academic circles are very different from what goes on in mainstream media, what goes on in conversations with your family members or your friends, because when you speak to the average person, a lot of individuals already believe that MAiD is part of palliative care because they see the common thread as death, right? A lot of people perceive palliative care ultimately as being about death, when it might be part of it, but it's not necessarily the center of it.
Well, and
right?
it's interesting because palliative care has often sort of, I think, struggled to resist that association, where people think of palliative care as that's when I'm giving up, that's when I'm going to a doctor. Basically, my life is gonna end soon. That's why I'm seeing a palliative care doctor. Whereas palliative care professionals would often portray the practice more as, we're here to support your quality of life. We're here to make the remaining life that you have living with some kind of terminal illness, life-threatening illness, as good as it can be. And that's kind of our goal. Now, sometimes in palliative care, the goal of managing symptoms and managing pain requires some kind of extreme interventions. And probably in the public consciousness, there's some people are kind of familiar with the idea of a doctor who's administering large doses of morphine to end pain, but it kind of doesn't that in the end up leading to the patient's death or something like that. So there's kind of been that association between palliative care and practices that lead to patient death, which might make it kind of a natural thing for people to then connect it with medical assistance in dying, which is a practice that does directly lead to patient death, intentionally so. The public has this kind of conception of things, and the professional, like palliative care professional associations and the founding thinkers of palliative care have tried to keep these two things separate. And we're kind of exploring this question, well, should they be separate? And you have this situation in Canada where MAiD is legal now, so MAiD is happening and somebody's providing it. And the question is, well, the palliative care specialists who traditionally have dealt with those who are, those who are dying and how to manage and deal with their situation, wouldn't they be kind of the natural people to take up MAiD? But then you have this kind of problem where that seems to clash with the professional identity of palliative care doctors. So what do we do about this, right? And what did we find? How did doctors help us to come any closer to answering this question or thinking through this question of whether MAiD should be part of palliative care?
A little bit, and in a very complex way. So basically, our findings came to the conclusion that there are sort of two schools of palliative care specialists. So we have the MAiD separationists that are very much of that traditional palliative care belief that MAiD is a separate practice from what is widely considered part of the palliative care toolbox, because MAiD directly brings about death, not in a roundabout way, not by accident or by proxy of some other procedure like the withdrawal of a breathing tube or something like that. And then we have the MAiD integrationists who do very much believe that it's already part of the palliative care toolbox. It's so integrated in my own professional practice among my patients' requests that why would it not be, right? That it's sort of like, why are we even having this debate? Of course it is. Now, by and large, and maybe unsurprisingly, palliative care specialists who adhere to that MAiD inclusionist school of thought provide MAiD themselves. And if they don't provide, at the very least, assess. Whereas those MAiD separationists have no involvement. They are either conscientious objectors or they just simply never got involved and sort of turn a bit of a blind eye to it. Which makes sense, right? They've sort of tailored their practice to what they're comfortable with, and there's no mandate in Canada saying that palliative care specialists have to provide MAiD. Physicians of any specialty can provide MAiD so long as they have that training. So I think that that's another interesting thing that we sort of came to. However, despite those two somewhat conflicting schools of thought, there was a shared belief that MAiD's not going anywhere anytime soon, nor do I think any of us believe that it is. I think that even among groups who don't want MAiD to exist in Canada, don't want the reach to be as far as it's become, which is an argument that has merits in its own right, that it's probably not rolling all the way back, because we just, generally speaking, we don't make policy progress that way, right? But there is a belief that these procedures need to, at the very least, have some sort of streamlining between them. So in Canada, as we know with our healthcare system, many practices and many specializations are very siloed, and it's very difficult to move between them when you have complex illnesses that might require you to see an oncologist and an endocrinologist or something like that. So there was a belief that there does need to be better connection for the patient experience, that if there is a palliative care specialist seeing a patient who wants MAiD, that palliative care specialist doesn't need to be involved. They don't need to provide or participate in a practice that is against their own moral code of conduct. But they do need to make sure that that patient is able to receive the treatment and the help that they need from someone else. So there needs to be better connection within our own healthcare system in that way, and it doesn't necessarily need to be through palliative care alone. And that was another belief echoed by a lot of our participants, was that, again, since MAiD isn't unique to palliative care, and since you can be even someone like a respirologist who's trained to assess or provide for MAiD, it's not unique to it, right? MAiD can be part of any specialization. It's sort of like if we have different specializations in medical school, MAiD is sort of here. It's just this sort of ether that everything else travels through, and that is not unique to one specific specialty, the way that cancer is to oncology, for example.
It sounds to me, from what you're saying, that we're in need in Canada of figuring out how we can make the reality of MAiD and of people who are asking for MAiD and needing to be assessed and receiving MAiD, how that system can coexist coexist with more traditional palliative care, centered on more like life-affirming ways of dealing with the kind of things people go through when they're dying, or just facing life-threatening illnesses. How can we make those two systems work together in a way that doesn't unduly blur the lines between them, that allows palliative care specialists to still practice in the way that they feel respects the integrity of what they're doing, but at the same time putting the patient first and the well-being of the patient first, and so recognizing that need to have integration and connection, some kind of connected working, so that it doesn't make things worse for the patient. How do we respect those two things, right? I mean, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
And that's $1 million question, right? I feel like if we could answer that, we might be in a better spot to begin with, and maybe there'd be less contention about the state of MAiD in general in Canada. But I think one of the big obstacles, which we saw even in our interviews, is that there's no provincially legislated mandate and there's no guidebook on how MAiD can or does coexist with palliative care. And it varies so much even within cities, depending on the hospital that you work for, that there are some hospitals where MAiD is generally taken for granted as part of palliative care. And no one really bats an eye about it because it's been like that since 2016. And then there are some even religiously based hospitals where MAiD is just not something that's considered in any ward in any part of the hospital, and you would need to be completely transferred to a non-denominational hospital, something like that, to even get any consideration to receive that procedure. So maybe that's the starting block. Maybe the starting point is developing some sort of mandate to say, okay, this, at least in a publicly funded hospital without a religious affiliation, these are, this is palliative care, this is MAiD, you can refer to, but it's not de facto part of palliative care. It's sort of its own thing. Maybe it's under intensive care. Maybe it's under, well, it wouldn't make sense to be under the emergency department, but maybe it's under something else where there's less of that strict, ethically based opposition to it, being so antithetical to the stated basis of the specialization, right? Yeah. But it is a very challenging question, and I think that is one that a lot of physicians who kind of question its fit within palliative medicine are asking themselves as well.
Yeah, just being involved in this project with you and thinking about the sort of trajectory of where we're trying to go, I feel like this is sort of a natural next step of what we're trying to get to with this research, to get to a point where we could maybe even make some recommendations about how Canada might structure its end-of-life care system in a way that respects the different kinds of ethical interests and concerns that are in the water, that different people are feeling in different ways. And I'm kind of hopeful that we might be able to take some meaningful steps toward that in the future. I don't know if you feel excited about that too, or as optimistic. Like you said, it's a huge question. It's a difficult thing to take on. But you've been doing a great job so far in trying to push this forward and hear the voices of Canadian doctors who are working on this kind of area. I just wonder, as we try to kind of wrap up our time together here, whether there's anything about this project that you'd particularly like to share, anything additional that we haven't covered that's on your mind?
I think this work is incredibly valuable. And as I've said, I might be biased because I'm close to the research. I've been kind of part of these projects from their onset. But I think that it's important not just bioethically and philosophically in advancing the way that we actually consider our own trains of logic and our own beliefs regarding these topics in end-of-life care. But there's important policy implications, which we've talked about a little bit in terms of how do we have these practices working together, if at all, how do we have connection between them, not just to make clinicians more comfortable in their places of practice, but most importantly, in my opinion, to improve that patient experience at end of life. because there is no monolithic end-of-life experience. The end of everyone's life is so different, whether it's from some sort of chronic illness, whether it's suddenly, but when it is chronic illness and palliative care is eventually going to be in the picture, it's important that patients have that choice, but true choice, where they're not being pigeonholed into any one thing, right? If it's easier for you to get MAiD than it is to get a hospice bed, that's not a choice. You've been restricted to one option over the other, and I think we can all agree, regardless of our philosophical beliefs, that that's not okay, right? That's not a freely made choice. And that's an important stipulation that we have to accommodate when we're considering autonomy in any way. And I think that even that just draws bigger questions to how do we make these systems better and more responsive to Canadians everywhere. And I believe that the conversations that we've had with these clinicians so far, who've been so gracious to give us their time, they've already started informing those conversations, and even they've had these considerations and they've had these experiences within their own hospital units and their own practices. And even being able to talk about it and consider those areas of discomfort, those areas where improvements could be made in the future, we're progressing towards something, right?
Mm-hmm. One other thing that comes to my mind in thinking about this is just the fact that medical assistance in dying has many different forms. You know, there's track 1 MAiD, which is for people whose death is reasonably foreseeable. Essentially people who are in the process of dying, more or less. They have a terminal illness that's going to take their life. And then there's track 2 MAiD, which was opened up a few years later, which potentially, the person receiving track 2 MAiD doesn't have to have a reasonably foreseeable death. They don't have to be dying anytime soon. And then, we're contemplating, basically we already have said as a country that MAiD for mental illness as a sole underlying medical condition is going to be a reality, within the next couple of years. I guess it's only about a year and a few months now, the projected date for that.
And it's been delayed a couple of times because they can't get it right. It's very contentious.
Right. Yeah. The farther you get away from that case of like traditional end of life person who's dying, the more controversial it becomes to engage in a practice that's ending that person's life. So when you think about these questions about the relationship between MAiD and palliative care, MAiD and withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, you kind of have to think of those questions differently depending on whether you're talking about track 1 MAiD or track 2 MAiD or MAiD by advanced directives for someone who's going to become incompetent later, or MAiD for mental illness as a sole underlying condition. And it seems like you'd have to kind of come up with different answers to the question, and different considerations would be relevant depending on those different forms of MAiD. And I feel like that might not be something that just anybody who doesn't really think about this very much, and they're just thinking about the relationship between MAiD and palliative care in a big picture, they might not think in terms of all those nuances.
Of course. Even as a researcher and someone who's not present at the bedside, of course, hearing about the liberalization of MAiD to mental illness, which again can kind of by proxy include people who are victims of social suffering, right? Like precarious housing, that sort of thing. It leaves a sour taste in your mouth. It really makes you wonder, we don't have universal basic income. We have an ever weakening social welfare net in Canada. How can we really allow MAiD's trajectory to keep going when we don't have other systems? Again, this idea of autonomy, right? Where if you can't truly consent to another different option because it's not there for you, then it's not a freely made choice, right? And I think that question of sort of track 2 MAiD came up a lot in our second study about MAiD and palliative care, that even among physicians that do provide MAiD that are comfortable with traditional track 1 MAiD, there is a strong discomfort around that liberalization. Because, as one physician actually very aptly put it, when we're dealing with individuals, say, who are suffering solely from mental illness, there's no involvement of palliative care there, right? Because it's not a foreseeable life-limiting illness that's going to result from COPD, from heart failure, right? It's just not the same thing. So how can you include MAiD in palliative care when that's potentially what patients are requesting, right? That's more of a question for psychiatry at that point. And as we well know, palliative psychiatry doesn't exist yet, right? We don't even really know what that looks like. There's been questions about what could that look like, but that specialization doesn't exist. It just simply doesn't at this point in time. So
it's like the need for it has been created by this new situation and this unfolding dynamic of trying to live in this reality of MAiD as part of our healthcare system.
Absolutely. And that's another big question that was raised by physicians through these interviews. And that really sat with me as well, that, yeah, how can you include MAiD in palliative care if it's a track 2 patient? Because we wouldn't be seeing them anyways. And that's food for thought, right? And that's something that perhaps we aren't having enough conversations about when we consider it to just de facto be part of palliative care.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time to discuss these 2 papers. People who are watching this, please check out the papers for yourself. We'd love to hear your feedback on them.
Open access.
Yeah, open access articles. In EMC Medical Ethics and Palliative Medicine Reports are the 2 places. You can probably find a link to those in relation to this post that we put up. Midori, just let me thank you again for being here and for all of your work on this. If you haven't solved all the problems of Canadian end-of-life care yet, best wishes on making some steps forward in the future and seeing what we can do.
Thanks for having me.